Welcome. Have you ever had an out-of-body experience? Not yet. I have them fairly often, actually. Generally 10 to 15 minutes after I've done something really stupid. And then I take a moment out and I watch myself as the realization dawns. But actually, have you ever had an out-of-planet experience? That's something grander, something less common, something very humbling, monumentally awe-inspiring. I think I've experienced this once in my life. It was in the Negev, the desert in southern Israel. Now, we'd set out on a 2-day hike from Beersheba, wild camping, no tents. We just put towels down on the sand. We used our backpacks as pillows. And the thing with deserts is there's nothing there. Save for a few wild goats or red-necked ostriches and probably more hyenas than we realized, we were alone. And when we decided to call it a night, we switched off our lanterns and the embers of our campfire dulled to a flaky whitish gray. I experienced natural darkness for the first time in my life. And then I discovered how bright darkness is. Weird stuff. Lying on my bag, the sand now molded to my body under my microfiber travel towel, the sky morphed from pitch black to a fiber optic light show. And the longer I looked, the more stars appeared. And then they started moving. Now, I want to stress that this isn't some hallucinatory tale. No mushrooms had been served at dinner. But suddenly, this, out-of-planet experience overcame me, and I no longer saw the stars as moving. I felt the earth moving. It was as if in that moment I tripped over a line and all at once became consciously aware of our whole planet hurtling through space. I felt gravity pinning me to the desert sand, and it felt amazing. The backache in the morning did not feel amazing. But that experience, though it's only my personal story, is oddly connected to this voyage, pole to pole. Because at some point in time, someone else had a realization or a sensation that this planning was spinning in a sea of stars. And that person did more with that moment of inspiration than I did. That person was the Greek philosopher Pythagoras. Back in the 6th century BCE, 2,600 years ago, Pythagoras was the first person to put forward the idea that the Earth is a sphere, the extension of which means that Earth would have to have poles, endpoints on an axis. Now, it'll be another 100 years or so before another Greek astronomer, Anaxagoras, would explicitly posit that the Earth rotates on an axis. And it will be another 100 years or so before Aristotle detailed this spherical nature on Earth in his works Meteorology and On the Heavens. But if you're looking for the first time anybody actually used the concept of poles in and of themselves, then we have to look 400 years after Pythagoras' opening gambit. In the 2nd century BCE, Hipparchus of Rhodes introduced the idea of polar coordinates, and he refined the earlier concepts of latitude and longitude. So while we're not going to Greece on this voyage, we are traveling in the tradition of the ancient Greek philosophers. We're going to places that they knew existed and yet never visited. I don't know how, but the ancient Greeks seem to be masters of that out-of-planet stuff. And then we descended into something of a dark age for centuries. It took 25 centuries from Pythagoras' conceptual discovery for someone to actually visit either of Earth's poles. Our planet traveled a total of 2,350,000,000,000 kilometers in the time it took humankind to arrive at the South Pole. But while it took us an awfully long time to arrive, that's not to say people weren't trying. Especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, people really were trying, often going to extraordinary lengths to go where no one had gone before. Today, I want to share with you 3 inspiring polar missions before going over a quick overview of our pole-to-pole voyage. We'll talk about the first confirmed missions to both poles. But first, let's head back in time to 1893 and join Fridtjof Nansen on board the polar exploration ship Fram. Its name, meaning forward in Norwegian, was a symbolic name for an adventurous spirit, ever seeking progress in an age of great discoveries. The Fram is now on display at the Fram Museum in Oslo, in case you're ever there. And now there are 2 distinctive features of the Fram's 1893 mission to the North Pole. One was the itinerary, the other was the ship. Let's start with the route. Nansen wasn't the first explorer to aim for the North Pole, and so he examined the itineraries of all of the failed missions that had tackled the journey ahead of him. And he noticed something that they had in common. They had almost all set out from Europe, heading into the Arctic Circle from the coast of Greenland. But Nansen knew there had to be another way. There had to be. How so? Remember, this was a time before Google Maps. The world was still being charted. How did this pioneering Norwegian know that there was another way to sail to the North Pole if nobody had ever done it? Well, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, Nansen's hypothesis of another route north came from the discovery of shipwrecked timbers found off the coast of Greenland. Timbers from the USS Jeanette, a ship that was known to have sunk in Siberian waters. How does a wrecked ship sail from Siberia to Greenland? It can only be carried by a current. So there had to be another way. Nansen's mission wasn't going to start in Greenland. It was going to end there, just like the USS Jeanette, but hopefully still in one piece. So that's part 1 of this mission, the itinerary, following this hypothesized transpolar current. The other part was the design of the ship itself. You see, this ship, the Fram, wasn't designed only to float on water. It was designed to float on ice. And by that, I mean they didn't actually intend to sail the Fram much at all. The plan was to freeze the Fram into the Arctic ice near the Siberian coast and just let the ship drift with the ice, carried by this current, ideally to the North Pole, or at least across the Arctic Ocean. So with this in mind, the Fram's rounded wooden hull was designed to push the ship upward when pressured by the ice, which would prevent it from being crushed. It was one of the strongest ships of its time, and it worked. Led by the committed Darwinist Nansen, the Fram's crew of 13 found themselves intentionally frozen into pack ice in September 1893, and then they just drifted slowly, really slowly. 18 months later, the Fram was still drifting in the Arctic, wedged in ice. And while plenty of scientific observations had been recorded and knowledge had certainly been advanced in the fields of oceanography and ice movements, Nansen knew from his celestial measurements that the Fram was not going to reach the North Pole. And so he did something which I highly discourage. He jumped overboard into the ocean, the Arctic Ocean. Except, of course, it was an ice field. And so, along with his pal, Hjalmar Johansen, a couple of dog sleds and kayaks, Nansen continued on his own steam. And he did remarkably well, reaching 86 degrees, 14 minutes north, which was a record for the time. But he didn't make it to the North Pole. At risk of running out of supplies, Nansen and Johansen decided to turn back. But you know what they left on the Fram? Their mobile phones. So they had no way of contacting the Fram to find out where they were, and they continued drifting along, frozen in ice. So Nansen and Johansen were actually rescued by another ship in Franz Josef Land in 1896, at around the same time that their crewmates eventually emerged near Svalbard. Incredibly, all 13 crew members returned home to Norway alive and well. Nansen never reached the North Pole, but his name is, to this very day, still connected with Arctic exploration. It was Robert Peary who claimed to finally take humanity to the North Pole. That was on April the 6th, 1909, a highly controversial claim that is still questioned to this day. So we know Nansen didn't make it to the pole. We're not convinced that Robert Peary did either. Who was the first person, beyond all doubt, to reach the North Pole? It was Roald Amundsen, the man whose name is forever linked with the South Pole. Imagine being the first person to visit either and both of Earth's poles. Well, we're going to return to Amundsen's arrival at the North Pole shortly. But let's take things in order, and we'll reboard a ship that we're already quite familiar with as we head south of the equator. Sailing on the proven expedition ship, Fram, back again. Amundsen's 1911 mission to the South Pole was shrouded in secrecy. Even his crew didn't know where they were going, because they weren't originally going to the South Pole. Amundsen had wanted to be the first person to reach the North Pole. But when he heard of Robert Peary's claims to have already achieved that, Amundsen's mission changed too. South Pole, because who on earth cares about number 2? Who was the second American in space? Virgil Grissom. Who cares? Amundsen refitted the famously successful Fram, stocking it with sled dogs, provisions, equipment, and off he sailed from Norway in June 1910. The ship sailed to the Bay of Whales on the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica in January 1911, which became Amundsen's base camp, Framheim. But this was as far as the Fram would get him, because unlike the North Pole, which is actually 4,261 meters below sea level in the Arctic Ocean, the South Pole is solid land capped by a 2,700 meter mountain of ice. So from here on in, it was going to be a hard slog, uphill, on ice. Oh, and they weren't the only ones there. To put the pressure on, Amundsen knew he was in competition with a British expedition led by Robert Falcon Scott, heading towards the pole from the direction of the McMurdo Sound. Amundsen and his team of 5 left the Framheim on 19th of October 1911 with 4 sledges, 52 dogs. Now they took a new, more direct route via the Axel Heiberg Glacier, which meant that they could avoid the Beardmore Glacier, which slowed Scott down. And so, on 14th of December 1911, it was Amundsen and his team who became the first people to reach the South Pole. And it was the Norwegian flag that was driven into the top layer of ice at the pole. But a flag wasn't the only thing they left at the pole. In a moment that I can't help that Phil was smothered in smugness, Amundsen's team left a tent prepared with supplies for Scott's team, with a note. Dear Captain Scott, as you are probably the first to reach this area after us, I will ask you kindly to forward the enclosed letter to King Haakon VII. If you can use any of the articles left in the tent, please do not hesitate to do so. With kind regards, yours truly, Roald Amundsen. The letter to the king read, to His Majesty King Haakon VII, King of Norway. Sir, I have the honor to inform your majesty that the Norwegian Antarctic expedition under my leadership has reached the South Pole on 14th December 1911. I hoist the Norwegian flag and give the plain on which the pole is located the name King Haakon VII's Plateau. Your obedient servant, Roald Amundsen. The note actually wasn't an exercise in gloating. It was a contingency plan. Polar exploration was, and is, exceedingly dangerous, and Roald Amundsen wanted to be sure that word of his achievement would make its way home even if he didn't. As events unfolded, it was Scott who wouldn't make it home. Amundsen's letters were found with Scott's body, preserved by the freezing temperatures in his snow-shrouded tent, just 18 kilometers from the nearest supply depot that could have saved them. Scott's diary, also in the tent, recorded his dejection at discovering that he had been beaten to the pole. In his entry, dated 17th of January 1912, 33 days after Amundsen had set up that South Pole tent, Scott wrote, "The Norwegians have forestalled us and are the first at the pole. It is a terrible disappointment, and I'm very sorry for my loyal companions." Today, both Amundsen and Scott are recognized at the South Pole. The American research station at the South Pole, established in 1956, is named the Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station in honor of both explorers. Perhaps people do care about who comes second. Anyway, it's now the beginning of 1912. Titanic is 3 months away from starting her sea trials in Belfast, and back 20,004 kilometers north from the South Pole, we still have a pole that is officially unvisited. As it became increasingly apparent that Robert Peary's claim to have reached the North Pole in April 1909 was unlikely to be accurate, Amundsen decided that it would be worth a visit after all. So it was the 1920s when he decided to give it a go. And a new way of travel was emerging. Airships. An international mission swung into being. An Italian engineer, Umberto Nobile, would design the airship and pilot it. An American, Lincoln Ellsworth, would bankroll the project. And a Norwegian, of course Amundsen, would provide the expedition its adventurous credentials. The expedition lasted 3 days, taking off from Svalbard on May 11th, 1926. The hydrogen-filled Norge propelled itself northwest in the direction of the North Pole. Its passengers, hanging in a gondola, included official observers, because unlike poor Peary, Amundsen wasn't going to leave any doubts of his visit to the pole. Now, the airship flew directly over the North Pole on May the 12th, 1926, and the Norwegian, Italian, and American flags were all unfurled from the gondola to mark the occasion. But there's only one flag at the North Pole today, and it's none of the above. So, for our final story of polar exploration, I want to introduce you to the people who really were the first to actually, truly, and honestly visit the North Pole. And it was pretty recent, 2007. That's less than 20 years ago. The flag that adorns the North Pole looks like this. In an expedition called Antarctica 2007, 2 mere submersibles carried 3 people and a titanium flag to the Arctic seabed to assert Russia's territorial claims under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The flag itself did nothing, beyond maybe annoying Canada, whose foreign minister tweeted, "This isn't the 15th century. You can't go around the world and just plant flags and say, we're claiming this territory." But Russia's Antarctica 2007 mission did successfully petition the UN's Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf to accept that large parts, though not all, of the Arctic seabed are indeed extension of Russia's continental shelf. It just goes to show that not a lot has changed since the 15th century when it comes to planting flags. But these days, humankind seems more concerned with flags on the moon, Mars, and the seabed than anywhere people might naturally survive. The man leading that mission, in case you want a name to go in your notes alongside Nansen, Amundsen, and Scott, was Arta Chilingarov. Right, well, I don't think any of us harbour any flag-planting intentions this cruise, though we are going to Panama and Greenland, so you never know. But let's take a quick overview of our own pole-to-pole adventure. This monumental 133-day grand voyage, round trip from Fort Lauderdale, visits 5 continents, 32 states or territories, and 68 individual ports of call. 800 of you have joined us for the complete journey, and we will be picking up additional guests at a few of our major destinations along the way. And throughout, you'll be looked after by a fantastic team of 600 team members. My role, as many of you already know, better than me usually, is to keep you entertained and informed throughout the voyage, and we've got a great entertainment team who'll be helping me deliver this, led by our entertainment director, Samantha. We have our World Stage Repertory Company with weekly production shows in here, and for those of you who were here with us last year, all new shows, totally new shows, so nothing repeating. Major talents are going to be joining us for stints during the voyage as well. Talking of local talent, we're looking forward to welcoming a series of guest chefs who'll be joining me for my cooking shows, which are going to be over in the Wayang Theatre, and they'll also be taking over the Pinnacle Grill with their authentically local pop-up dinners through the cruise. So these tend to sell out. If you are interested, I would suggest that you book early with those, or just book the whole series today. You can always adjust your plans later. Nobody's going to hold you to it. So if you're interested in the local dinners, just get them booked and see nearer the time if you want to hold on to it. Live music, whether it's classical, jazz, piano bar, dance music, fills the lounges every night of the cruise, and our special themed nights are going to be adding something a little extra for a really memorable experience all round. Now, a big part of what I do comes down to port information. You can always review my personal notes online. If you search Daniel Edward Port Guides or Cruise Port Guides into Google, it will come up with my personal notes. But I'm going to be offering port enrichment presentations throughout the cruise at 11 o'clock in here on Sea Days. These will then be televised as well if you want to catch up with anything afterwards. And in the evenings prior to our port arrivals, I'll be leading Q&A sessions about each port as well, so we can cover off any of the essential logistical information and answer any of your last-minute questions. For shore excursions questions, please always visit the shore excursions team led by Natalie, because they've got the best answers for that, and I'll focus more on the independent stuff. But I am far from the only speaker on board this cruise. We'll be hosting an inspiring and informative enrichment program that will feature lecturers coming from all different walks of life and different topics. We've got astronomy, wildlife, culture, icebergs, the lot. So we're going to be joined by local ambassadors, wildlife guides. That's going to elevate our experiences of Antarctica and Brazil, the Amazon River. And we've got our creative enrichment program as well, keeping you entertained throughout the cruise. Watercolors, drawing workshops, creative writing, daily crafting sessions. There is so much going on. So where are we visiting? Well, if I spent just 1 minute on each port, we'd be here for another hour and 10 minutes. So I'm going to give you the summary version. We're making our way towards the Panama Canal currently, a monumental feat of human engineering, still working exactly the way it did when it opened 111 years ago, and we will be using the original locks, which is very exciting. Once on the Pacific coast, we'll be following the coastline of South America. Stops in Ecuador, Peru, Chile, before we nip around the end of the world and call in Ushuaia, Argentina. And then we leave countries behind altogether. 2 days at sea leads us to the only continent without trees, the only continent with no permanent residents. The driest continent. It's interesting. The only continent without country borders, the only continent without passports. Though it does still have a lot of flags. and a post office. That is, of course, Antarctica. Antarctica will be a major highlight of this voyage, and we're excited to have our Antarctica expedition team who'll be joining us for that part. Then back up north, we pop into the Falkland Islands before rejoining the South American mainland, this time on the Atlantic coast, for more of Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, including, of course, a jaunt up the Amazon River, and French Guiana. Our transatlantic crossing takes us to two of Cape Verde's beautiful islands at Lanzarote, ahead of our journey up the west coast of Africa, where we'll call in Gambia, Senegal, and Morocco. Next up on our 5-month journey, we'll arrive in Europe, starting with the Rock of Gibraltar, and then enjoying an overnight in Barcelona, where we'll be docked right next to Zuiderdam, completing her world cruise. Portugal, France, Belgium, the Netherlands complete our time in mainland Europe, and then it's time for a day in the magical city of Edinburgh. And then further north, as we make our way nearer and nearer to the North Pole. Norway, Iceland, and Greenland make for a thrilling and chilling westbound transatlantic crossing, which we will then conclude with some time in Canada's Maritimes, some Pierre and Miquelon, and then east coast of the States. The next time we'll be back in the States will be in June. At least the snow should have melted by then. For now, welcome on board. I hope you have a fantastic grand voyage with us, and if there is anything any of us can do to make it special, please let us know. And appreciate everything that you see and get to experience through this time, whether you've been there before or not. Succumbing to that out-of-planet experience is incredible, and this cruise is just right for it.